One of the questions that I see and hear most often from photographers that are wanting to get into the business side of photography is, how much should I charge? How much should a session be? In this video, I want to give you my tips and my suggestions on how to figure that out. Let's talk about it. What up, YouTube? It's your boy Anthony, back with another video. It's been a minute. You already know the drill, so we ain't gonna get into that one. And this is what I want to talk about: photography pricing. All the time on forums and Facebook groups and just in person, I see and hear the question all the time: how much should I charge for my photography? How much should this type of session be? And the thing about photography pricing is that it's not as simple as I think people may think it is. And one of the biggest mistakes that you can make is just coming up with an arbitrary number of how much you want to charge, or going to someone's website that does photography in your area, seeing what they charge and then charging the same thing. In my opinion, that's a really big mistake, because there are a lot of factors that go into how you should be determining your pricing for photography. And that's what we're going to discuss in this video. But when you just come up with an arbitrary number, it doesn't give you the leeway to be able to make adjustments to your pricing as your business changes, or if you encounter a slow year, or if we have something like the pandemic where you got to figure out what you need to do to be able to make things work. You really can't do that when you just come up with a number and you say, this is what I'm charging. Now, before I get into all the nitty gritty of my suggestions and recommendations on how you should determine your photography pricing, let me give a couple of disclaimers. Number one, these are just my opinions, my tips, my suggestions. This is no way meant to be, this is exactly how you have to price photography services. I really think it differs for every person and every person's circumstances. So you really can't just take a spreadsheet, plug in some numbers and say, this is what my pricing is. You really have to just use this as a baseline, and you kind of take this information and build with it based on your business and your circumstances. So that's number one. Number two, this is really meant for people that do portrait type sessions. So when I say portrait, I do mean that to include everything. So your regular portraits, engagements, newborns, boudoir, all of that stuff, portrait sessions. This is not for people that are in the commercial space. Commercial pricing is going to be significantly different in how you figure that out than just your typical portrait type session. So for commercial and even for wedding pricing is going to be different. You can kind of use the same fundamentals, but both commercial and wedding really are kind of different in that structure. So if that's the type of pricing that you're looking to figure out, I would highly recommend you go look at another video that would speak specifically to that. I am a portrait photographer, so that's the space and mindset of where I'm coming at with this. So again, this isn't meant to be, oh, this is how you have to figure out pricing. I'm sure there's still going to be some finance guy that's going to drop a comment telling me how I don't know what I'm talking about and I'm all wrong. Because that always happens. It always happens. Unhappy people. So now that we got those disclaimers out the way, let's jump into the 6 things that I think you need to take into account when figuring out what your pricing needs to be. Number one is your cost of doing business, or your overhead cost. And basically what this is all of the costs that are associated to you running and operating your business. So you have your website cost, or your email hosting, website hosting, business email, editing software, any software that you need to do your editing, business insurance, auto insurance, if you have office or studio rental space, your utilities, any local and state fees that you may have. If you're an LLC or corporation, your cost for your registered agent. If you have an assistant or you have employees, whatever you're paying them, your marketing costs, everything associated with doing your marketing, any professional fees that you have for accountants or attorneys or anything of the sort. All of these things should be factored into your cost of doing business. To put it simply, your CODB, or your overhead costs, are going to be every penny that you have to pay out to be able to keep your business functional and running and up to date on everything that you have to pay. So basically, from a business perspective, you want to bring in at least enough money to cover your cost of doing business. That would be your break-even number, to where Obviously, you wouldn't be profitable and your business wouldn't be sustainable if you only break even every year, but at least you're not having to come out of pocket of your own personal money to cover your overhead costs. So that is number one. Number two is your profit. How much money do you want to make per year? Now, this would be money that's coming in addition to the money that you're paying out for your overhead costs. So basically, your salary is the number that you set for yourself, that you pay yourself to be able to cover your personal expenses and things that are outside of the business. Now, obviously, you get to set this number. There is no guideline of how much money you need to make. You really should take into account your personal expenses. So your rent or mortgage, your insurance costs, health, child, auto, all of those things, for food, and just the quality of life that you want to live. How much money do you need to make to be able to sustain that lifestyle that you choose? Obviously, you want to keep this number reasonable. You most certainly can say, hey, I want to make $100,000 a year. You can say that number, but if your skill set and your market doesn't allow for you to make that type of money, you're never going to achieve that. So it's kind of like setting goals. You do want to aim high, but you also need to be realistic and set goals that are attainable. So it's the same thing with your salary. Obviously, you can strive to make a crap ton of money off of photography, but you really need to be realistic so that way it is something that you can achieve. Number three, you need to take into account company profit. Now, a lot of people, when they discuss figuring out your pricing, they don't take into account company profit. And I've never really understood that, because as a business, you need to bring in money that is solely for your company. And that is to cover unexpected costs or company growth. Obviously, as you're in business year after year after year, you're going to want to expand that business to some degree. And you need to have the capital to be able to do that, because expansion typically costs money. And unexpected costs, you don't want to have to come out of your personal pocket and take that from your salary to be able to cover those. So company profit, you need to figure out how much money you want to set aside each year that is solely for the company profit. This is money that will go into a fund or go into your standard account, but be allocated strictly for company related expenses. Again, this is different than your overhead costs. You've already calculated that, so you're going to account for that in your pricing. The company profit is just meant to be able to grow your business or to cover unforeseen expenses. So figure out what you want that number to be. This is very similar to your profit, your salary. You can come up with whatever number you want, but again, it really needs to be realistic and something that is attainable. Number four is gear depreciation. And I think a lot of times people don't take into account this item either. Gear depreciation is basically money that you are setting aside to account for the wear and tear and ultimate replacement of the gear that you're using in your business. Now, the standard range for photography equipment is 3 to 5 years. So when you're calculating the depreciation, you're doing that on a 3 to 5 year scale based on the cost of the item. Now, let me say and shut this down right now. I'm not saying you should replace your gear every 3 to 5 years. As a matter of fact, that would be dumb to arbitrarily replace your gear. If you have a camera that you've had for 10 years and it is still getting the job done and it's not causing you any problems, by all means, keep that gear. Don't just replace it because you've had it for 5 years. But in terms of figuring out your photography pricing and taking into account gear depreciation, you want to base that off of 3 to 5 years, depending upon what the item is. Something like a flash or something like that, you can do 5 years. Something like a camera, you could do 3 years, depending upon technology. The whole point of it is to be able to have money allocated for when you need to replace gear, you use that money. So instead of having to use your company profit or dip into your salary to be able to replace that gear, you have money that is set aside and allocated for the sole purpose of replacing gear as it goes out of service, or if it needs repair or anything of the sort, you have money set aside specifically for that. Number 5 is your time and labor costs. Now, this is one that's a little bit tricky to figure out because you really need to know a lot of numbers to really nail this down and be able to figure out exactly what your labor cost per hour is. But a way to get you to a ballpark number is to take your salary, the amount that you want to make per year, and divide that by the number of compensated hours you anticipate working every year. Now, notice I said compensated hours. That is different than just hours worked. When you are running a business, you're going to work a lot of hours that you don't get direct compensation for. So take, for example, if you have to update your portfolio, or you're creating marketing material, or you're out doing marketing, or you're doing back-end accounting work, or you get a phone call from a potential client, or you're going out to do location scouting just so that way you know for potential clients. All of these things are hours that you are putting in the work, but you're not getting direct compensation for that. No one is paying you to create your marketing materials or go out and scout. These are things that you are doing that you hope to ultimately be compensated for at the end of the year based off of your pricing, but you're not getting directly compensated for that. So when I say take your salary and divide it by your compensated hours are going to be hours that you are putting in that you expect to be directly compensated for. Now, in order to get to that number, you first have to figure out how much time total it takes you to do a given session. So let's say you are a portrait photographer and you do portrait sessions. From start to finish and everything in between, you need to calculate how many hours it takes you to do that session. And when I say from start to finish, I'm going to put something on the screen to show you the breakdown of how I've calculated the time that I am putting into each session. It needs to be very, very detailed, because when you're doing these sessions, you ultimately want to get compensated for every minute that you are spending in association to that specific session. So for the sake of this video and to keep it simple, let's say that number is 10. Okay, so you're putting 10 hours into every session. So now that you know that, now you have to decide how many sessions do I want to try to do every year. Now, obviously, this is an estimate. You have no way to know exactly how many sessions you're going to be able to do in a year. And as you're in business longer and longer, you can obviously refine that and get it to be much more accurate than you can if you're just getting into it. But at the end of the day, you have to pick a number that you want to strive for. So we know that the session is going to take 10 hours. And let's say we want to do 10 sessions per month. So per month, we're looking at 100 compensated hours, because when we figure out our session pricing, we're going to make sure that we're compensated for all 10 of those hours for each session. So we're looking at 100 compensated hours per month. So if we multiply that by 12, that gives us 12,000 or 1,200 compensated hours per year. So you basically will take your salary, divide that by your 1,200 compensated hours, and that gives you your hourly rate for just your labor portion. The last thing to keep in mind, and the worst thing that we have to account for as business owners, is taxes. You're absolutely going to have taxes. Here in California, I set aside 40% of the money that I bring in for taxes. I know it's sickening. It sucks. I hate paying it, but it is what it is. Taxes are a way of the world. It's all a crime and they're robbing us, but it is what it is. We have to pay taxes. So you have to take that into account for figuring out your photography pricing. One of the mistakes that people just figuring out their prices that they make is that they don't take into account those taxes. So they figure out this number and say, I need to make X amount of dollars per session. But then when it comes time to pay their taxes, 30% of that money that they brought in is now gone, and they didn't account for that. So now you're essentially 30% short on your income from being able to cover all of your expenses. So you have to take your taxes into consideration when you're figuring out what your pricing should be, so that way you're not short at the end of the year. So quick recap. Number one, cost of doing business, overhead costs, everything that's involved and all the costs associated with you running and operating your business. Number two, your profit. How much money do you want to make per year? Number three, your company profit. How much money do you want to set aside for company growth? Number four, gear depreciation. How much money do you need to set aside to be able to replace gear as it goes out of service? Number five, your time and labor costs. What do you need to charge per hour to cover your salary? And number six is taxes. How much do you need to set aside to be able to pay Uncle Sam at the end of the year? Okay, so you have all of these numbers, you figured out all of this stuff, but how does that help you figure out how much to charge for your photography? So let's take these numbers and let's break it down and let's get you there. Now you've already figured out what your labor cost is. So how much do you need to charge per hour to be able to essentially cover your salary? Now you need to take everything else. So your overhead cost, your company profit, your gear depreciation, and your taxes, sum all of that up and then divide that by your compensated hours per year. So I'm going to move over here to my laptop and let's just put some numbers in. So let's just say arbitrarily, I'm just going to come up with numbers just to kind of keep it simple. Let's say we want to make $24,000 per year as a salary. And again, we're doing 1,200 compensated hours per year. Okay, so we've got that 24,000. If we divide the 24,000 by the 1,200, we get $20 an hour. So we know we need to charge at least $20 per hour just to cover our salary cost. Okay, so now if we take into account, let's say our overhead costs are $10,000 per year. Let's say our company profit, we want to set aside $2,500 per year. Gear depreciation, we want to account for $1,000 per year. And taxes, let's say, because taxes are ridiculous, let's just say $15,000 per year in taxes. So that gives us a cost of $28,500 per year that we have for all of our overhead costs. So if we take that $28,500 and we again divide that by our 1,200 compensated hours, it gives us $23.75. So when you add those together, it's $43.75. For the sake of keeping it simple, let's just say $45. So we know that based off of the estimated number of compensated hours per year that we want to bill for, or that we want to be paid for, we need to be charging at least $45 per hour to be able to bring in enough income to cover everything. Now, a moment ago, we figured out that our sessions are going to be 10 hours. We need to be compensated for 10 hours for each session that we do. So if we take that $45 per hour number and we multiply that by 10 hours, that means that our session needs to be $450 to be able to cover everything. That's simple, right? Nothing else. If only it were that simple. If only it were that easy. It is not. We unfortunately cannot stop there, because just because we figure out these numbers and we say this is how much we need to make to be able to bring in the income that we need to be able to fulfill all of our obligations, there's other things that need to be taken into consideration. Number one is you have to evaluate your market. Just because you've calculated that you need to charge $450 per session doesn't mean that your market tolerance will allow for you to charge $450 per session. If the market that you're in, the going rate is $200 per session, it could be very difficult for you to come in and try to charge $450 per session. People will look at that and do the comparison and say, yeah, that's way too much. And you could alienate yourself and not get business. So you have to take into account market tolerance. What is the going rate for your services in your market? Now, let me say, just because your number is higher than the average going rate in your market certainly doesn't mean that you can't still charge what you need to charge. And we'll get into that more later in the video. But you do need to keep that in mind and understand that if your rate is significantly higher than the going rate or the market average, you're going to have to do some things different to be able to get people to pay your price. So you have to take into account market tolerance. Number two, you have to evaluate your perceived value. What are you bringing to the table? You're charging $450 per session. What is your client getting for their money? Are they going to see value in that? Are they going to feel like they are getting their money's worth in paying that $450? If the value that you are offering to your client isn't perceived as being worth it, you're going to have a hard time booking clients at that rate. So you have to be very honest with yourself and say, if I'm charging $450, am I giving a quality product for $450? Am I giving the experience? Am I giving the customer service? Am I giving my client the value for the money that they're paying? If the answer is no, then you have to evaluate your cost somewhere. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later in the video. Number three, you have to determine your work quality and service provided to your client. And I touched on that in perceived value, but you really have to look at where you are as a photographer. If you are a new photographer just getting into the game and your work is not as strong as some of the other photographers in your area, you have to be realistic with yourself and understand that you're not going to be able to charge the same amount of money as a new photographer, as a photographer that's been in the game for 10 years, or as a photographer that has a very, very, very solid portfolio and some very strong body of work. You have to align yourself with your skill set and what you can provide to your client. If you're just getting into the game, even though you've calculated that you need to charge $450 per session, if you're new into the game and you're just starting out, it may not be realistic for you to do that. You're going to have a hard time getting clients, and you're going to have a hard time building that client base, because people are not going to be able to see where what you're providing is worth the money that you're charging. And again, you'll alienate yourself. So you have to be realistic in this process. Yes, you've come up with this number of where you need to be, but now you got to take into these other things into account, and that may mean you need to lower this number. Now, on top of that, you also need to figure out what is your business model for your photography. So do you offer a package where, say, a portrait session is 1 hour and you get 30 digital images? Or do you have, print packages built in? Are you more of a hourly rate person? That would be something for event photography, but some portrait photographers may charge an hourly rate as well. Do you want to go that route? Or do you want to have the business model where you have your session fee and then the client purchase the images separately? Do you want to have print sales? All of these things need to be figured out, because based off of your business model is going to dictate how you need to charge for things. Obviously, if you're charging on a per hour basis, that's going to be different than if you just have a package where essentially you can still kind of do the same thing, but you're building it all in. So you need to know what business model you want to have. Obviously, that's completely up to you and how you want to structure your business. You can do it however you see fit. You can look at what's going on in your market and maybe do something a little different to set yourself apart. Or if you know that one way works, you can go that way. How you set up your business model isn't important, but knowing what that business model is very important in determining how to figure out what your pricing needs to be. So what do you do if the cost per session that you've calculated is higher than your market tolerance? Inevitably, you're going to have to adjust some numbers somewhere. So let's look at some ways of how you can do that. Number one, you can reduce your overhead costs. This is where you should always start. If your session price is higher than where it needs to be based off of market tolerance and perceived value, look at your cost of doing business. Is there something that you can cut out to make your overhead cost less? If you're just getting into photography, I would highly recommend you stick to the basics. Don't do anything too crazy. Have just what you need to be able to get the job done with no extras. That way you keep that overhead cost low. Number two, you can reduce your profit or your company's profit. Now, obviously, if you're reducing your profit, you need to make sure that you still bring in enough money to be able to cover your personal expenses. But if you were a little zealous on how much money you want to make per year, you can really look at bringing that number down into a more realistic range to help you bring down what that session cost needs to be to get it within the range of your market tolerance. Or you can reduce how much money you want to put into your company profit. Now, obviously, year after year, you can adjust these numbers. So maybe, in your first year, you're only making $18,000 and only putting $2,000 in company profit. But then by the time you get to year 5, you've brought that up to $30,000 and $5,000 respectively. So obviously, you can adjust these numbers year after year. Number 3, you can strive to acquire more sessions. So obviously we calculated that we were going to do 10 sessions per month, which equated to 120 sessions per year. If using those numbers gets you to a session price that is outside of market tolerance, you certainly could just strive to do more sessions. So instead of doing 10 sessions per month, we can strive to do 15 sessions per month. And what that ultimately is going to do is bring down our cost per session. So instead of being $450 per session, that might bring it down to $375 or $350. So we're bringing that cost down. So now we can bring down the total cost that would put us within the range of the market tolerance. Number 4, you can increase your perceived value by adding services or providing an experience for your client. Again, as I said earlier, just because your number that you've calculated is more expensive than others in your area doesn't mean that you can't charge that much, but you have to convince your clients why the number that you're charging is worth it. If you're going to charge $450 when everyone else is charging $200, you have to convince your client why you're worth that extra $250. And that can be done. If a client feels like they're getting their money's worth, even if they're paying double the cost of another photographer, if they feel like they're getting their money's worth, they will still pay it. I see it all the time. There are a lot of photographers whose work is not that strong, but they make a lot of money because they provide an experience for their client, or they have exceptional customer service. Whatever the case may be, their clients feel that the money that they're paying is worth it, and therefore that photographer makes a lot of money. So you can increase that perceived value so that you can continue to charge what you need to charge to make the money that you need to make, even though you're outside of what your market typically would tolerate. Number 5, you can upsell. Now, you really should be upselling regardless. You should always be trying to upsell because as a business, you always want to make as much money as you possibly can. Never leave money on the table if you can avoid it. So you should always be trying to upsell. But if your session cost is higher than where it really can be, upselling is a great way to be able to bring in some extra money to account for that. So when you look at a session in general, you look at photography in general, you're going to have good months and you're going to have bad months. So you're always going to look at ways where if I'm a little short over here, what can I do over here to bring in a little bit of extra money to be able to account for the loss that we have over here? That really can be in just your session pricing in general. If you do different types of sessions, maybe your portrait session is this, your engagement session is this. Some are going to be more profitable than others depending upon the session, your client base, what the market will allow. So sometimes you could say, hey, I might lose a bit of money over here, but if I make a point to make a little bit extra over here, that's going to account for the loss. And again, what you're looking at really is your end of year goal. And that's why it's important that you have these numbers and these metrics, because you can look at things month after month and say, am I on target to be where I need to be at the end of the year? So it's kind of like the stock market in a lot of ways. You might have a really good month and you have a slow month, but it all balances out. And at the end, if you get to where your number needs to be, then you still win. And then anything extra that you have over top of that is great. So you most certainly can try to do more upselling if you need to lower your cost, but you still need to get in the equivalent of $450 per session. Maybe you bring it down to $350 and you figure out a way to upsell to recoup that $100 that you're losing on your session pricing. And the last thing, and I just kind of touched on it, is to account for higher profit margin items to account for lower profit margin items. So in other words, if you have to bring down the cost of something, or if there's something where you need to price it aggressively, so you're in some ways losing money, look at other items that you have where you can have a bigger profit margin. So where this is realized very often in the photography world is in print sales. Obviously when you're looking at your 4x6s, your 5x7s, even your 8x10s, maybe even your 11x14s, you can only charge so much for those. If you're trying to charge $150 for an 8x10 print, you might have a hard time selling a lot of those. So a lot of times you may lose money on that print, but then when you get into say a 24x36, this can be a higher profit margin item, because typically someone that's buying a 2-foot-by-3-foot print understand that there's going to be a sizable cost there, and they may only be buying one of them. So if you charge say $500 or $600 for that item, that higher profit margin will account for your lower profit margin over here on your 8x10s. So in terms of your photography pricing, like for your services, it really can function the same way. If you have this session to where based off of the session, you really can't get to that $450 mark. If you offer this type of session over here, say this is a portrait, this is, an engagement or a family session where typically people are going to spend more money anyway, then you have a higher profit margin up here and you charge a little bit more for this session. So that way it offsets the cost of this session that you had to bring down that cost for. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. I know it was a lot of information thrown in there, but I really wanted to put this video out because I typically don't see people really diving into the details of how to price photography and take all these things into account and how to make it all work. Now, again, like I said, this is really just a baseline. Every person is going to be different. Every business is different. Every market is different. Every niche is different. So how you come to your number is not going to be as easy as I've illustrated in this video, but hopefully this does get the wheels turning and you can take this as a baseline and build off of it. The key thing to keep in mind is you really have to take into account everything that you have to pay out as a business and then how much you want to pay yourself, and you add it together and then you figure out how much money you need to make to be able to cover the cost of all those things. At the end of the day, that really is the basis of how you figure out your photography pricing. There's things that you have to pay. There's money you want to make. You need to bring money in to cover all of that. That's the simplest form of it. But you want to get as detailed as possible, because again, if you have to start making adjustments to any of those numbers to be able to stay on target for how much money you need to bring in per year, or if you even want to look at it on a per month basis, you need to know the breakdown of what those numbers are so you know what you need to adjust. By doing it this way, if I look at my month to month and I say, man, you know, I'm down 3 sessions, then I can make a goal for that third month to say, hey, instead of 10 sessions, I really want to strive to book 15 sessions this month. And I can work extra hard to go out and market and get those clients to be able to have those 15 sessions to get me back on target for, you know, that 4th month. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to drop those down in the comments or send me a message on YouTube if you can do that, or go to my Instagram page and send me a DM there. I would be more than happy to answer any questions for things that I have knowledge on that I can answer. And if I can't answer your question, I'll direct you somewhere else, or I'll tell you, hey, I don't know, because I don't know everything. So hopefully that was helpful. Good luck with your journey figuring out your photography pricing. Hopefully you are staying safe and healthy. It sucks to hear that, you know, COVID stuff is creeping back in again. We're required to wear masks indoors here again. So it's really unfortunate, but it is what it is. So please stay healthy out there, but, you know, enjoy life at the same time. So until the next video, do your thing. Take care.